You don't procrastinate because the task is hard. You procrastinate because starting it creates a feeling your brain wants to escape. That feeling might be boredom, it might be anxiety, it might be self-doubt. But in the tasks that matter most, it is usually something more specific. The possibility that the work will reveal something about you. This is why you can answer messages, clean your desk, research tools, reorganize notes, and still avoid the one thing you claim is important. You are not avoiding effort, you are avoiding exposure. The research has a name for this. Procrastination is not a time management problem, it is an emotion regulation problem. And once you understand that, most advice about discipline starts to look like it was built for the wrong disease. For most of its documented history as a subject of study, procrastination was treated as a scheduling failure. The implied intervention was better organization, clearer deadlines, stronger commitment devices, more discipline. The research kept pointing somewhere else. In 2013, Fuschia, Sirois and Timothy Pychyl published the results of a research program that had been building for years toward a single finding. Chronic procrastinators and non-procrastinators don't differ in their intentions, their goals, or their confidence in their ability to complete the task. They differ in what they do with the negative feeling the task generates. When faced with a task associated with anxiety, boredom, frustration, or anticipated failure, non-procrastinators tolerate the discomfort and begin anyway. Chronic procrastinators prioritize something else, the immediate reduction of that discomfort. They manage the feeling first. The task waits. The procrastination is not about the task. It is about the feeling. And the feeling is being managed successfully by not starting. The reason this pattern sustains itself is that it works, not long-term, immediately. The moment you decide not to start, the anxiety drops. The relief is real, it arrives fast, and the brain's reinforcement learning system registers it as a successful strategy. Avoidance reduces the threat. Do it again. The cost, the task undone, the deadline approaching, the consequences accumulating, arrives later. The brain discounts future consequences relative to immediate relief at a rate that is not rational by any long-term standard, but is perfectly consistent with how reinforcement learning operates. Immediate relief outweighs future cost, reliably, until the future cost becomes immediate enough to generate its own anxiety. This is why deadline pressure produces action in procrastinators without solving anything. It works by making the future cost immediate, changing the emotional calculation in the moment, but it does nothing to the underlying pattern. The behavior is still driven by affect regulation. The procrastinator who works under deadline pressure is still procrastinating. They've just moved the avoidance to the last possible position. The other thing deadline pressure does is confirm a story. I work best under pressure. That story is almost never true in the way it's told. What's true is that pressure is the only condition that finally makes the cost of not starting exceed the cost of starting. The work produced under those conditions is not better. It is just the only work that got produced. The story converts a structural failure into a personality trait, and the personality trait makes the next cycle more likely. Here is the part that breaks the standard model completely. The strength of the emotional signal driving avoidance is not proportional to how much you dislike the task. It is proportional to how much is at stake. Research by Pychyl and colleagues found that procrastination is worst on tasks that are personally meaningful, identity-relevant, and associated with fear of failure. Not tasks that are tedious or unpleasant in themselves. Tasks that matter. The mechanism: a task that matters activates stronger threat processing because failure carries more consequence. More threat processing means a stronger avoidance impulse. A stronger avoidance impulse requires more prefrontal override capacity to initiate, and that capacity is finite. This is why the writer procrastinates on the novel more than on the grocery list. The grocery list cannot prove you are mediocre. The novel can. The grocery list carries no identity threat. Getting it wrong is costless. The novel is tied to self-concept, to years of investment, to fears about whether the work will be good enough to justify the identity being claimed. The emotional signal is correspondingly more intense. The result is a pattern that looks, from outside, like the person doesn't care. They clearly care more about the novel than the grocery list. They procrastinate on the novel constantly and complete the grocery list immediately. Caring more is causing the procrastination, not preventing it. Perfectionism runs the same mechanism and amplifies it. Research on perfectionism and procrastination has established that the relationship runs specifically through self-oriented perfectionism, the demand placed on oneself to produce work that meets a high internal standard, combined with fear of failure. The perfectionist procrastinates not because they don't want to produce good work. They procrastinate because beginning the work initiates the possibility of the work not being good enough. Beginning is the threat. As long as the work doesn't exist, it can't be judged. Perfectionism is not high standards. It is often delayed humiliation management. Psychologist Gordon Flett describes this as the procrastination perfectionism loop. The perfectionist delays because the standard is high. The delay makes conditions worse. The worse conditions make meeting the standard less likely, which makes the perfectionist delay further to preserve the theoretical possibility of perfect execution under better conditions that never arrive. The loop runs until external deadline pressure makes it impossible to continue, at which point the work gets done under conditions that virtually guarantee it won't meet the original standard, confirming the perfectionist's fears and setting up the same loop for the next project. The work that doesn't exist can't be judged. That protection is worth more to the nervous system than any outcome the completed work might produce. What Flett's research also found is that the perfectionist rarely identifies their delay as self-protection. They experience it as waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right level of readiness. The narrative is forward-looking, preparing, planning, getting ready. The actual function is backward-looking, avoiding the record of what happens when the work finally exists and can be evaluated. The neuroscience of procrastination implicates two systems whose relationship appears across most research on self-regulation failure. The limbic system processes the emotional signal associated with the task, the boredom, the anxiety, the anticipated difficulty or failure. That signal is fast, powerful, and generates an avoidance impulse that precedes any deliberate evaluation. The prefrontal cortex is capable of overriding that impulse, holding the long-term goal in mind, evaluating the actual consequences of avoidance, and initiating behavior despite the effective signal. You want to start. You know you should start. You know exactly what to do, and still your body does not move. That is not weakness. That is the limbic signal outrunning the prefrontal override. Brain imaging research has found structural and functional differences between chronic procrastinators and non-procrastinators in both regions. Procrastinators show, on average, a larger amygdala, the structure central to emotional threat processing, and weaker functional connectivity between the amygdala and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the region that translates intention into action. Chronic procrastinators aren't less motivated or less intelligent. They have a nervous system that generates stronger emotional signals in response to aversive tasks, and a weaker connection between intention and initiation. The experience of procrastination, wanting to do the thing, feeling bad about not doing it, and still not doing it, is the output of a specific neural architecture, not a character deficit. Digital distraction did not create this pattern. It made avoidance more rewarding than it has ever been. Historically, the available substitute for an aversive task was limited. Cleaning, organizing, another task that was at least somewhat demanding. The emotional regulation benefit of avoidance was real, but bounded by what was available to escape into. A smartphone running an algorithmically optimized feed changes this calculation fundamentally. The alternative to any aversive task is now content engineered specifically to maintain engagement, variable reward at a frequency that dopamine systems respond to most powerfully. The relief of avoidance has been maximized because the substitute has been optimized for exactly the neurological vulnerability that drives the pattern. Research by Adrian Ward and colleagues, published in 2017, found that having a phone on a desk, face down, silent, reduced available cognitive capacity for the task in front of the person. The brain was partially occupied with the effort of not checking it. The phone didn't need to be used to consume resources. Its presence was sufficient. The same nervous system that was procrastinating in 2005 is procrastinating more in 2025, not because something about the person has changed, but because avoidance has become structurally more rewarding. The intervention that follows from this is not motivational, it is environmental. Remove the substitute. Change what avoidance costs. There is one element of the standard response to procrastination that actively makes the pattern worse. Every time you punish yourself for procrastinating, you attach more negative effect to the task and to the act of beginning. You are strengthening the avoidance signal. The self-criticism that is meant to produce action is producing the opposite, increasing the emotional cost of the domain, making future avoidance more likely. Self-compassion research, across multiple studies, has shown that treating an episode of procrastination with the same understanding you would extend to a friend, acknowledging the mechanism without punishment, reduces future procrastination. Not because self-compassion eliminates the avoidance impulse, because it stops compounding it. The mechanism is direct. Self-criticism following avoidance increases the aversive emotional content associated with the task. More aversive content means a stronger avoidance signal the next time the task appears. The punishment that is supposed to correct the behavior is calibrating the brain to avoid more, not less. This is the finding that is hardest to accept in a culture that treats procrastination as a moral failing. Every conversation that frames avoidance as laziness or weakness increases the negative affect attached to the tasks and to the self. The cultural story that procrastinators need to toughen up and just do the work is producing the opposite of what it intends. For a subset of chronic procrastinators, the pattern runs deeper than task-level affect regulation. It becomes structural to identity. Research by Pychyl and Flett found that for people who procrastinate chronically across most domains, the behavior has often become part of how they understand themselves. The procrastinator identity carries specific psychological functions. It explains poor outcomes without requiring confrontation with ability or effort. It maintains a self-concept of potential. Chronic procrastination protects the fantasy of potential. The work hasn't been done yet, which means the high-quality work is still theoretically possible. The person who hasn't written the novel is still, in some operative sense, a person who might write a great novel. The moment the novel exists, that possibility collapses into whatever the novel actually is. Not beginning is a strategy for remaining someone who might be exceptional rather than becoming someone who found out. Breaking this pattern at the identity level requires not just changing the behavior, but understanding what the behavior is doing for the self-concept. Task-level interventions are often insufficient for this population because they don't address the deeper function the procrastination is serving. The fantasy of potential is not incidental to the pattern, it is the point. This is also why the chronic procrastinator can describe the pattern with perfect accuracy and still not stop. Insight does not dissolve a defense that is doing structural work. The person who understands, intellectually, that they are protecting a fantasy of potential still needs that protection to be somewhere else before they can release it. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as no longer needing what the mechanism provides. What makes this particularly difficult to address is that the procrastinator identity often carries a secondary function. It positions the person as someone whose situation is temporary. Not someone who failed to write the novel, but someone who hasn't written it yet. The yet is load-bearing. It holds the self-concept in a permanent state of imminence, always about to begin, never having begun, never having found out. Sirois and Pychyl concluded their research program with a finding that the time management framing had systematically obscured for decades. The procrastinator's problem is not that they don't know what they should be doing or when they should be doing it. They know. They have usually known for some time. The plan exists. The intention is genuine. The gap is not between knowing and planning, it is between planning and initiating, and that gap is not closed by knowing more or planning better. The problem is that knowing and doing are different systems. The knowing is available to conscious access, articulable as a plan. The doing requires initiating behavior in the presence of an effective signal that is recommending against it. And that initiation is not automatic, not guaranteed by knowing what should happen, and not achievable simply by deciding to try harder. The procrastinator who believes their problem is discipline has the wrong model of their own behavior. Their nervous system is responding appropriately to the emotional conditions of the task in the way that nervous systems were built to respond. The behavior is not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as designed, optimizing for immediate relief, discounting future cost, protecting the self from exposure. You were never fighting the task. You were fighting the feeling that appears when the task starts telling you who you might be. If you made it this far, thank you. That means a lot. And if this video shifted something for you or gave you a different way of seeing how your mind works, consider subscribing. There's more coming, and it's built on the same standard as what you just watched. I'll see you in the next one.